Okay, hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this third webinar, how to write and engage for and with media. My name is Annette Dubray, and I am just finishing working with Canada's Ecofiscal Commission. I was their communications director and was with that project the whole time since 2014. And as part of that role, I did media relations. So today I'm going to walk through a couple of things. Why do media relations in the first place? And then how to think about what you need to do and think about what you should do, strategy, to do good media. And so that's part of a media relations plan. So this is actually comes from the University of Waterloo. They have a media relations guide, which is quite good. And they basically had 5 reasons why to do media. The first one I hadn't thought of, but it makes sense, is to help get grad students. Students are media savvy today. They use many different tools to decide how or who they'll study with. And so if you're on the media, they'll find you. The other thing is granting agencies consider media activities for funding. And so that media helps for grant applications. And then collaborations, finding colleagues. Being in the media helps you be known to others. And this is especially interesting for cross-field collaborations, right? People in your field might know you, but with the more interdisciplinary wicked problems, research that's possible these days, collaborations are emerging, and so being in the media helps. At the Ecofiscal Commission, we focused a lot on this 4th one, which is influencing policy makers, but you could also influence practices in the private sector or in NGOs. And then finally, of course, knowledge mobilization, getting to the public, the general public, and increasing education are things. So all different reasons why you might do media. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the presentation is I'm going to kind of zero in on doing media for a specific research project or report, and how you would think through that. But from time to time, there'll be little bits of things that are could be reactive to something, a current event happening, for example. So within strategy, we've got a couple things you want to do before you get to your media strategy. You want to think about your research goals, your communications goals, and then you can get to your media goals. So research goals are more specific than the reasons to do media we just talked about. So of course, it could be the generic ones about wanting to increase your chances of getting funding or finding students, but you could be very specific in perhaps wanting to change a carbon pricing policy like the Ecofiscal Commission did, or change ESG practices in business. Educate the public about something like water scarcity. And from time to time, maybe your communications goals, yeah, I'll come to that. So your research goal would be quite specific. And then when it comes to communication goals, you want to kind of cover the rest of the W. So research goals are why you're going to communicate, but there's also who, what, when, and where. And I'll get on the next slide, we'll do how, which will be tactics. So who? So if you're reaching policymakers, I'm using carbon pricing a lot, but in that case, you want environment and finance ministers, ministries, the policymakers and the ministers in those ministries to be aware of your work. And so you want to get to them through the media. And I'll just put a caveat here that you would also want to maybe do government relations and directly communicate with them. Then what? What do you want to communicate to them about through the media? And sometimes that will be a very specific part of your research, because of course you're going to have way more material in your report than you can communicate via the media. And so you have to choose one part of a message or something specific like what's new in your report, or it could be why it's important, or sometimes it's the who's involved in the research, or the emotional appeal of the people that are affected by the research that will allow you to make this thing be media worthy. When it comes to when, you want to make sure that you're not competing with other things. So when you pick the date to launch, you want to make sure that there'll be media that cover your topic available. And so if something really big is happening the same day, you might want to pick a different day. And then where, we'll get down to what media your audience read and engage. So Eric showed us that boomers are especially reading newspapers. So if that's your target, then you know you need to go for newspapers. We also want to think about where the research will be available. If you have a website or a research center that you're affiliated with, that it can be posted so that you can send them to a specific place. And you can actually say that in the interview. You can say the research is available at website.ca so that they know how to find you. And similarly, when you do an interview and you're getting an article written about your report, it's great practice to ask for a link to your research to be included in the article. And a number of media outlets will do that. Some of them don't, so you always have to ask. But it's well worth doing so. And finally, where can also be in person. Sometimes we do events to help. So some examples of media goals could be to change the conversation on an issue. So really game changer. A goal could be just to get as much coverage as possible, to do as much educating as possible. You could be in a specific targeted way. You could say, okay, we want to reach business audiences on sustainable finance, or water practitioners in municipalities, and get really targeted, so then your publications will flow from that. And sometimes the goal is to get as many of your findings into the discourse, and so you really want to write an op-ed so that you can really articulate your message fully and in depth. And then the last one I'll mention is educating the media. For complicated topics that are hot topics, you want the media to understand as much as possible what the issue is about, so that they're as informed and covering the issue objectively rather than ideologically. And so educating the media is an important goal, and I'll come back to that later with things that you can do for educating them. So the tactics. So there's a lot of tactics that can be used. And I'll just differentiate these two columns, that the direct tactics to your audience are things that you own, like your newsletters, your report, your blogs, if you're part of a center or an organization, or even your own personal blog. And then there's also things you can pay for, like social media advertising. And then the second column is things that are done via the media. So they're earned media. And so you need to do something in order to get that media, usually. And sometimes, yes, a report will be launched and somebody will just hear about it and cover it. But usually there's a couple things that happen in between that media happening and the report. And so let's go through some of them. Now, the press release and backrunner, we'll get to those in more depth later. They typically, in our experience, don't get a lot of media. The media came from these things that are further down the list. So to get an article, you have to pitch, you have to request writing an article. And sometimes you'll do that with a draft already written, and you just submit it and say, please, would you like to publish this? It's important not to submit to 2 places at once. They want exclusivity with those. The next one, editorial board meetings. You can request if the editorial board would like to meet with you to hear about your research, and sometimes that will increase the odds of them writing an editorial about your research, although they certainly will do that in general if it's a hot topic. To get articles written about your piece, usually there has to be an interview with the journalist first. And so you're requesting the journalist to have a look at your piece. And that can often include giving them an embargo copy of your report in advance. And then finally, interviews with hosts. So television, radio, podcasts, you have to get the interview or the segment booked. And so this can vary. With the TV, it's often via producers. With radio, it can often be directly with the host of the radio show. Podcasts, it varies depending on the size of the podcast. So when we go back to our examples of reaching a business audience, then maybe you would say, okay, well, we want to get into Globe and Mail, and we want a piece in the business section, and we also want to do an op-ed, or we're going to try for both, and maybe we'll get one, and maybe we won't. So that you can get more and more specific on the goals. Okay. Here's another way of thinking about media. There's news media, there's social media, and there's web media. So we've already covered a lot of these tactics. I'll just flag a few others that can be helpful with it in the world of research. So one is Google Scholar. When you fill out the metadata of your report, it will automatically get put in there. It somehow finds it, or you can also make sure that your research is in Google Scholar. And that helps other people find your research, including the media. A LinkedIn SlideShare, you can post a presentation of your findings of your research, or if you do a webinar, and that's another resource that can help be found. And then consider partnerships as well. So we always want to reach certain groups, but sometimes we don't have direct access to them, and having partnerships that have access to those audiences can be a way of amplifying your work and getting to who you're trying to reach. So once you've decided what you're going to do, then you have to obviously do it. So there's a number of things that you do in advance, which are preparatory, and they include a number of products, and we'll go through some of these. So these first 4 things are what you need to do to prepare for interviews. And the first one is super important because often interviews are really short. If you're on the radio, it can be or even TV, sometimes the segment is as small as 3 minutes. So you really want to be getting your message out quickly and succinctly and clearly, so that your segment gets as much, you get as much out of it as you can. And so a message map is something where you create a key message and a few 3 to 5 messages total. So you can have 2 to 4 additional messages, and these would support what you're saying. And you have to decide what's important for your audience to know and what you're trying to do with this research. And so the bigger, more wonky details can come later, but you want to stay really high level for that general audience, because if you're doing radio, it's not a technical audience. The next piece is the spokespeople. When you're doing interviews, sometimes you'll be, if it's your report, it's your research, you're the one doing interviews. But with an organization, in a think tank situation, you might have other people who can do interviews, or there might be multiple researchers who are involved. And so you have to decide who's going to be speaking, and you want to make sure that they're trained to know what the messages are. Especially in a larger organization, you're going to have a small core team developing the messages, and then they're shared with other people. And then this next part is super important, especially if you've not done media before, but even if you have, it's really important, especially if you're dealing with a more contentious issue. And that's to do media training or practice in mock interviews. And So this is a way to practice. It's a way to iterate on the messages, because as you say them out loud in a mock interview situation, you might change the wording. And they're really important to practice right before an interview so that you're fresh and up to date with where you're going. And finally, the Q&A is a guide that you create for yourself. So you take some time and you think about the tricky questions that reporters may ask, and then you draft answers. And then you can also practice answering those trickier questions so that when a reporter asks that question, your answer isn't like, you don't want to freeze, right? You want to be ready to respond. And then the last couple of things I'll say about interviews that we did, it's good to do is getting grounded before an interview, just really taking some time, maybe doing some stretching or some walking, taking some deep breaths. So just really being present to and ready for the interview. And so we do all of this stuff before we launch a report, so we're ready to do interviews. And also, if you get asked to do an interview last minute on a current event, you would also want to take some time, a few minutes, and just think about what you want to say. So the press release. Press releases are still used quite a bit. There's a number of things that go into a press release. You want an eye-catching, newsworthy headline, because that's the first thing people will read, and you know, if they're not interested by that, they might not keep reading. So it has to be clear. And press releases are written in a kind of an opposite way than other pieces. You want to kind of lead with all the key information so that they quickly get the gist of what it is, and then you can move to details. Press releases usually have supporting quotes, and then media contact is really important. The bigger your report launch and the more media you might get, the more you want to have somebody who can be supporting you to field media calls on the day of launch. The other thing about press releases is that you want to use the active voice and make the media's job as easy as possible with telling a fairly full story in your press release so that they understand what you're trying to do. And then the other thing about the press release is that while we use them, they often don't get that much media. The media often comes from pitching, which we'll talk about next in the next section. So the press release sometimes can be used for other reasons, like that summary of the report you can sometimes use in other places, and a few times we've used it at EcoFiscal as the report summary as well. So there's some efficiencies that can be had. Now, a backgrounder is another document that goes into more detail that you can provide to media, and this is really good for really technical things. And you could also create a fact sheet, which would be more of a bulleted list tool. And so if you are having trouble getting the gist into your press release, or there are supporting facts that you want to provide, go ahead and make those additional materials. The last thing about this section is the technical briefing. So when you have a really complex topic, sometimes it's quite good to walk the media through the material rather than just having them read it on their own. And that can be done in a number of ways. You can host a webinar and invite them, or you can do an in-person briefing. So for example, the National Press Theatre in Ottawa, that can be booked and media will come in person and have an opportunity to ask questions in person. So media lists. So we need to decide who we're pitching. And there's a number of tools, and I won't go through these all in detail, but there's a number of ways of finding media, and you have to build a list to know who you want to reach out to, journalists, and you can use free ones or paid ones, and there's I mean, the nice thing about the paid ones is you can get really specific with keywords and have a nice list there, but they can be quite costly as well. So media pitching. Just before I do that, I'm just going to go over quickly that the media context continues to become busier than ever, and the 24/7 news cycle continues to speed things up. So, and even in the last 5 years, there's still been quite a bit of change. So they are really busy. So it's good to really give media what's appropriate for them, and make sure that you are being as transparent as possible, and that you're not reaching the same media, or sorry, media in the same organization. And so this comes to list prioritization. So if I want to reach, say at the CBC, I have 3 reporters that I'm interested in, I would always prioritize them and reach out to A first. And only if A says no, then I go to B. So you don't you don't reach everybody equally. And this is done in advance. So you'll see there with the lead times that print these days, I find 2 to 4 days is enough. If I contact people more in advance, they go, oh yeah, contact me later, too busy. They won't commit too far in advance. But with TV and magazines, there is a long lead time, so you do need to reach out and be planning further in advance. And radio can be quite quick. Now that said, if it's a really hot topic, for example, an opinion piece, you could get in the same day. So it does vary. And about how to contact the media, typically I find email works best. They're very busy. They don't want to talk on the phone often. And then finally, I'll just repeat that the media education is important. And I think emailing media the day of launch to say, hey, I wanted you to know that this research is now out and it's available if you're interested, that allows them to check it out on their own time. But it's clear that you're not asking them to cover it, that it's already been covered. And finally, relationship building. So if the reporters know you or know your work beforehand, they're more likely to cover or notice your emails because they are really busy. And so a few tips on how to get to know them. So obviously you can follow them on Twitter and engage with them in conversations there. You can also invite them for coffee. So if you are in town for a conference, you could say, hey, I'm in town, I would love to talk to you about my research. And request a meal, or treat them to a meal. That's okay. It's also really great to be helpful, so to treat them as well as possible. So this is common things like responding quickly to emails, and if you're not the right person, giving them an alternative person to contact. But it's also, as I mentioned before, preparing for interviews. And you can also send them useful information from time to time. So for example, at the Ecofiscal Commission, we created some fact sheets and we're able to give them that information. So we weren't saying this isn't a story, but here's information that might be useful to you in covering the topic that we care about. And then finally, expert advisories. So this is when you email people, media, when there's a current news story. So this is outreach that's not about, it's about your research, but indirectly, right? You're saying, I'm an expert on this topic and I would be able to comment on what's just happened. Here's a quote, or here's a blog, or link to some of the work that I've done on this topic. So being responsive that way can really get you quite a bit of media. At the Ecofiscal Commission, we had a policy options piece on low carbon exports that Jason Dion had written in the summer, and that piece was picked up by media a number of times, and when we sent it to them, a lot of them really thanked us for that useful information. Another thing to consider is to amplify your work. And so there are resources out there. For example, if you're at a university or college, there might be a media relations office or in an organization, you have a comms team who can help you get interviews and help you amplify things on social media, for example. And so really make sure you're reaching out to them and that you're not doing this alone. And of course, you can also hire somebody with a PR company if you're so inclined. And then make sure to amplify your own work on your social media if you have some. And you can tag the reporter, and that helps build a relationship with the reporter. And then finally, partners and colleagues. It's great to create an amplification guide where you provide some sample tweets and they can go through. So I have spoken long enough. So I'm happy to take some questions now if you would like. You can go into the Q&A if you have any, and I will see. So Victoria asks, how do you handle media misrepresenting your research findings? Yeah, so sometimes you can ask for a correction, but the best thing to do is to try to be as clear as possible with the media when you're giving your interviews. It does happen, especially some outlets might take a different perspective. It's tricky. And actually the University of Waterloo Media Guide had some more tips on that, so I would refer you to that for more ideas. It didn't happen to us too much, but certainly if they really are wrong, if they misquote you and it's completely wrong, a journalist, you would email them and ask them to make a correction. Question about how to deal with debates when on social media when things escalate. We found that the best thing to do is just to be more curious. So to really ask open-ended questions and truly try to connect with the person that you're debating with, and then see if there's movement, right? If you're really communicating, then there'll be some movement, there'll be some shift. If they're totally not able to shift a little bit, if they're really stuck in their place, then sometimes it's better just to mute or to block the person and just it's not worth the time. Caesar's asking, offering the achievements of your research exclusively to one journalist could be more efficient than sending press releases to multiple journalists. Yes, sometimes. So people do like to have exclusives. And so the pro of an exclusive is that if somebody says, yes, I will for sure cover this as an exclusive, you're getting some media coverage. The downside is that maybe you'll only be in one outlet, because if somebody has an exclusive on launch day A or 1, the media is less likely to cover it the next day because they'll say it's already been covered. One way to kind of get around that is to give your exclusive to the Canadian press, because the Canadian press gets picked up by many outlets, including big publications like the Globe and Mail. So that can be true. Yeah, so it really depends what your goals are and how much media you're hoping to get. Yadira asks, what are some do's and don'ts when having an interview? Yeah. So don't repeat the negative. If somebody says whatever, you want to not repeat that negative thing. You want to make it as personal as possible. So if you have personal examples, it just makes you more relatable and more human during the interview. And there's some other little things that are technical, like not wearing small patterns or stripes if you're on TV. Not talking too long-winded, so you want to talk in shorter sentences. Things like that. Okay, so for someone with no Twitter account, how to begin? Yeah, I mean, some people grow slowly on Twitter and some people grow quickly. It depends, I think, how much effort you put into it. It is good to start following people. If you start with people who know you, they're more likely to follow you back. Your first tweet can be anything, really. You can introduce yourself. It can just be something interesting that you have to say, and this is why you're on Twitter. I think it can really vary. I saw a tweet the other day where somebody said, oh, I only have 12 people, but I want to share this thing, and then it had blown up. Like, you never really know what's going to go viral. Well, thanks everyone for your questions, and good luck disseminating your research via the media, and I hope you all have a great day.